Welcome back. Hope you enjoyed your break, took part in our competition. Now, the first workshop today, sponsored by ApprovalMax. Fraud doesn't always happen where you expect it. So this workshop will uncover some common blind spots in accounts payable, procurement and expense management processes, all waiting for fraudsters to exploit them. What can you do to detect and address them before they cost your business? To take you through this workshop, Ian Cartledge is with us, an account executive at ApprovalMax, a software platform which is used around the world to build robust financial controls with a streamlined approval process. Ian has a decade of experience in complex software as a service solutions, working on unique and innovative models as required across diverse markets. And Robert Brooker, who we heard in our last panel, director at Opus Forensic Accountants, an accredited counter-fraud specialist, highly trained experience in financial investigations and fraud risk management. Welcome, gentlemen. You have your 30 minutes.
Thank you, Sue, very much. Ian, you're on mute.
There's always one, isn't there? And it had to be me today.
Well, it was me the session before, so.
So, start again. Apart from someone who obviously forgets that he's on mute, my name's Ian. I work for ApprovalMax. We're a leader in approval workflow automation. And I fundamentally, the core remit of my role is to help finance teams explore how to strengthen their controls with automated approval workflows. I work with them on ensuring compliance and ultimately reducing the fraud risks that go along with those processes. I'm actually really excited about this session because I know Robert has some really interesting stuff that we're going to dive into. And Rob, I was going to ask you to introduce yourself, but it sounds like everyone already knows you.
Well, having just done another session, Ian, there's probably a chance of that. So, yeah, I'm just because basically I work for Opus, which is a forensic accounting firm, and I work as an accountant with investigations, fraud risk management, education awareness and training, so forth. So, yeah, anytime. That's me. I've worked in it now 27 years, both private and public sector. And yeah, it never ceases to amaze me.
It's interesting. I mean, so for today's talk, we're going to be diving into the evolving fraud landscape and discussing practical strategies to close those gaps in processes. I'm sure along the way, we'll look at things like how automated controls can help those, like those that we kind of support with here at ApprovalMax. But I did want to throw open the first poll kind of straight away, which is I'd like to kick things off just to understand from the audience where people's minds are themselves when it comes to fraud. So the poll itself at the moment, what is your biggest concern regarding financial fraud in your organization? It'd be good to get a feel for what people are currently thinking about. Yeah, and it's interesting. It mirrors the conversations I have quite regularly, and there's the predominant here, obviously, external payment fraud, lack of visibility, and then delayed detection. Robert, for you, maybe you can tell us a bit more about kind of taking that into consideration. What are some of the kind of most commonly used types of scams at the minute by criminals that you're seeing or you're aware of, kind of fraudulently access payments and things like that?
Yeah, of course. And that's really interesting, isn't it? Is that no employee collusion or the insider threat. Now, that interests me greatly in how we can discuss that. And none of you are confident in your current fraud prevention measures, which equally would indicate to me that they kind of are a bit of a conflict there between the top one and the bottom one, because I would expect if you had complete faith in your measures, then you'd be happy that there's no insider threat. But actually, how are you measuring what that insider threat is if you are actually confident in the prevention you're undertaking? So that just for me is quite interesting before we start this, because that's what it's about now, isn't it?
Yeah.
Is the moving landscape of fraud has really changed, as Ian alluded to there, in terms of how fraud is created. We just talked in the previous session around AI. And what types of fraud are we all experiencing? And I think we've all, the long in the tooth, if you like, for the normal push payment fraud and your normal kind of bank diversion fraud. What we're seeing is there, but it's how it's being developed using different processes. And I think then you can't get away from, and you've alluded to it as an audience very much, in that we go back to the basics around account takeover fraud, upgrading to take over business accounts using stolen credentials, which is becoming, if you think of the AI conversation, becoming a lot more sophisticated. Phishing, smishing, and vishing, which obviously, as we discussed, is very common, and that's what you're seeing. The vendor fraud, which is the collusion. Now, this is where I'm coming at from the fact you're saying invoice fraud, and vendor fraud is the collusion between the employee and the vendor, and the overcharging or the services of goods or services that aren't delivered. And what I'm seeing, I'm just dealt with a case, it's in the throes of prosecution at the moment with regards to, and I remain anonymous at the moment because unfortunately it's not in the public eye at all, but somebody orders 100 of something, a very valuable, in the FMCG world, a very valuable commodity they ordered 100 of. But the truth of it was the business only got 50. And the other 50 was shared between the insider and the salesperson from the vendor. And then what they do, they go and sell them elsewhere, or he pushes them out off his own back, and he pays your man a percentage because he's colluded with him to commit that fraud. And then obviously that happens with then the invoice fraud that goes with it, and that's what we're seeing. And obviously, clearly you are too. I think the variety of invoice fraud that we're seeing is probably very, very prevalent at the moment from the fraudsters. And I think internally, again, we're thinking about how this works and what it looks like. And I think we take it internally, face inwards first, is looking at that aggregating. So you might have invoices that are coming out from your business, and people are sending them out without having to utilize their procurement function. So they might have sign off for 100,000. They want to buy something for 400,000. They'll put 4 or 5 payments through a 95. That kind of thing is what we're seeing. And then we go into what we're now seeing more, and um, isn't necessarily the run of the mill, Ian, which wire transfer fraud, yes, we're seeing it. Fraud as a service, we've all heard of software as a service, but this is an emerging threat that I'm seeing now, and cyber criminals are offering on marketplaces, on the dark web, but also I am believing now using tools like ChatGPT and WormGPT, they're selling it online now, allowing cyber criminals to generate the templates and other materials because it's already there for them. They make it accessible for even an amateur, and you might just dip your toe in it rather than being a serious organised crime gang. If we then combine that with what we talked about previously, synthetic ID fraud, combining real and fake information, then we look at deep fake technology and the way that people are doing that. And we obviously business email compromise we've touched on, and identity fraud. Then the other bit that's worrying me greatly is by the end of this year here in the UK, and I believe it's in other countries already, we will have digital passports and driving licenses. Now, that's your identity to be able to use as being somebody that's working with you, somebody that's obviously one of your vendors, is that all genuine? The kickbacks we'll always talk about, obviously. Check fraud, we don't necessarily have over here in the UK at the moment. Is very, very prevalent still in the States. What I'm interesting about that, though, small, medium enterprises reverting to checks because they don't have confidence in the online banking system.
Yeah.
And then obviously ACH, Automated Clearinghouse, which we've got both here in the States. Reimbursement fraud. I dealt with a job for, let's just say, the everyday, big yellow and blue, with regards to reimbursement fraud. And again, it was an insider because they were getting people to buy, you put through a chargeback as such, and then you keep the goods and nobody bats an eyelid. And when you actually concentrate it geographically, everybody was in the same area, and there was an insider also approving that. They get the chargebacks, they get their money back, and nobody ever pursued the goods. It was more hassle to go and collect. The truth of it was the insider was just sending it out to friends and family. But that's exactly how it happens and what there is, Ian. So yeah, a very much widening thought around fraud typologies now, and what we're seeing. And I think that's the important piece. We need to be on our toes, as you said, Ian, and employ somebody like ApprovalMax or whatever to do what you're doing.
Yeah, and You mentioned there deepfakes, and I think it was something that we kind of touched on when we caught up last week. There was a really interesting case that caught my eye online when I was doing my reading around Arup, who suffered a deepfake scam in Hong Kong. One of their employees was tricked into paying out $25 million to fraudsters, I think it was. And that was essentially somebody, they thought they were on a Zoom call with one of the senior leadership who insisted that they made a payment happen. And it ultimately, it would never have happened had the right processes been in place in terms of that automated side of things, which is kind of where we come at things from an ApprovalMax perspective. That even with the strongest manual processes, companies have blind spots, and it leaves companies vulnerable to fraud because there's none of those checks and balances, and there's often edge cases that circumvent the kind of the manual flow, if you like. So I think one of the big things for me, I was curious. Obviously, loss of cash is an obvious one when it comes to downsides. Are there any other kind of, if you like, downsides that you can think of that really hit home for like people that you're working with that you're seeing at the moment, that just aside from the loss of cash for business?
Yeah, of course. There's the bigger picture with cash as well there, Ian. There's a bigger picture of when you suffer a loss and you then investigate it. So actually, do you bring in an outside company? Is it just yourselves and your resources? And if you was to measure that time and effort that goes into it, and then you've got the issue of if it is an insider and there is collusion, we now have the morale around the company because unfortunately somebody within our midst has committed fraud.
Mm.
And then what does that do to you as a team? You're the manager or you work alongside them, somebody you trusted, probably been to lunch with as a minimum, but as a maximum, I know a lot of people socialize with their friends and holidays and all that kind of thing. So that whole team motivation and morale is very difficult. Then obviously that doesn't have a financial impact, but the financial impact of the investigation itself, looking to then get a temporary member of staff in to cover it, looking then to obviously you've got recruitment fees, the cost of having a temporary member of staff, because I appreciate accounts payable, particularly, you're extremely busy people, you need somebody immediately, then the advert for a permanent role and getting somebody in place and all of the on costs that go with that. Then the replacement of that money, how do you get that money back and what does it cost you? Do you put up your pricing? Does that then cause a fraction amongst your supply chain, amongst your customer base? Do they not now pay from you? They go and get it elsewhere because you've got to try and recover that money somewhere. Hopefully, you've got insurances in place. That's the speculating to accumulate, and you might have fraud insurance. Highly recommend people look at fraud insurance now. There are products out there that cover all this kind of thing, and from investigation to replacing of staff. Most importantly, for you as a business, what does that do to your business? What does it do to your shareholders? First of all, your shares have dived. Secondly, what does it do to your customers, your clients? They can go elsewhere now, can't they? Who's going to use a company that have been a victim of fraud?
Yeah.
Who's going to use a company whereby they don't have a confidence in your product or service anymore? There are plenty more out there. It doesn't matter what you do. And actually, what is that knock-on effect? And as you say, Ian, there's both that internal, external impact of a fraud. There's also that financial and non-financial impact of that fraud that ultimately builds around your whole reputation and your business and your whole kind of loss of confidence in what you do.
Yeah. And it's interesting because for me, when I'm talking to various finance teams, that the common piece is that there are certain, if you like, checks and balances that can be put in place using an automated workflow. So real-time fraud alerts, using multi-level approvals, audit trails, all these things that come as part of the ApprovalMax package that help. But when it comes to kind of your experience, are there patterns that you kind of see where fraud commonly slips through kind of what are thought to be secure processes? So obviously we very much are vocal about, we think automation helps because it allows you to trust the automated policies. People have to approve things in a certain way. There are no edge cases, etc., etc. If you were to say, okay, people that have more of a manual process, are there certain areas where you see that often falling down, or are there patterns where you maybe think, actually, this could have been avoidable?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because how do you expose it? What does that control process look like? What control framework do you have? How are they exploiting your vulnerabilities, your systems, and your processes? So when you really look at it like that, you start considering what do we have in place? How can we prevent it? And what do we do to deter it? And if you look at the whole way through that, the whole way through it is really quite interesting in what do you have in place? What do you implement? How do you prevent fraud? And what, as you say, Ian, quite rightly, are those common themes that lead to that demise, if you like, of what you're doing? And part of this is around a lack of training, education, and awareness in your staff, in your supply chain, knowing what to do, how to go about it, your customers. And that is a weakness. I see it regularly. There is a pattern that works and that happens. The collusion piece, if you've got the collusion, you've got the education awareness, you prevent that.
Yeah.
You really do. The transparency, so you make it harder for fraudulent activities to go unnoticed. You create ethical behavior. You have a culture that is counter fraud.
Yeah.
And you work together on that, i.e., you whistleblow, you do whatever because you want to protect your business and you want to do it. Then we get into the reporting, the analytics. What key measures do you have in place? So what we see often, and you just alluded to some of that then, Ian, is around identity trends. So identify exactly where the fraudulent activities are coming in. Is it because you've got zeros and fives at the end, for instance? Do you have continuous monitoring to prevent that? Do you have that control framework in place? Because that's what fraudsters do. Rarely will they be sending you odd numbers. They don't appreciate it.
Yeah.
Have you got continuous monitoring for your unusual patterns and transforms? Do you do continuous improvement? So you look at what happened to weakness that control weakness led to that potential fraud. You might have spotted it, which is great. How do you close that gap and mitigate against that from happening again? And just remember, that's thematically across the rest of your business. It won't just be one area, it will be the whole business that they do it. The other I see a lot of in is around employee access and who has access to sensitive systems and data.
Yeah.
So that we ensure we have compliance and we don't do. And sadly, they're out of date. They're not strong enough. They're not robust enough. The right chain of command isn't in there with approval processes. Do you have audit logs to detect the unauthorized access or change? Do you actually review your payments for fraudulent practices regularly on a real-time basis, as you're alluding to? Or can you catch it earlier rather than when it's happened? And these are all patterns that lead to it because a control framework isn't necessarily measured regularly. It really is variety. And the other I always talk about is dormant accounts. And dormant accounts are rife for fraud. Okay, you've got dormant account sitting there, and I've seen this time and time again. People have dormant accounts for 5 to 7, 10 years. It's easy enough to set up an invoice. Back to your point here on the slides, set up an invoice for a dormant account. Nobody even bats an eyelid at it because they're a supplier at one time. Why don't we clear them off? What do we need them for after 12 months, for instance?
Yeah.
And then you've got there, we talk about the duplication. I talked about obviously the single sourcing. If you are working with supply chain, you're working in procurement, what's single sourcing about? They've just been on a 3-year contract. You've known for 3 years it comes to an end at the 31st of March, for argument's sake.
Yeah.
What are we doing then taking single sourcing to allow that contractor to get it again? What's in it for that commercial manager who's asking you to do that? What's in it for them? I never understand single sourcing. I really don't. One-time vendors, why can't we set up a PO and have a proper organized and arranged within our own, and this is what I always talk about, your onboarding process.
Yeah.
If that onboarding process is done, then you haven't got to worry about it. And yeah, we talked about below the limit, surprise pricing, all that kind of thing. Familiarity breeds content. Okay. So how about the fact that we're dealing with one supplier all the time, for example? We've got a framework there, procurement framework. Do we share the love or do we just go to one company all the time? And why is that? But that's all back to the continuous monitoring and that continual having an oversight of exactly what your spend is and where it's going in.
Yeah. On that note, it'd be quite interesting to open the next poll because that poll specifically focuses on with the people on the session. What methods are you currently using to detect potential fraud? So whether that's manual audits, automated alerts, maybe you're relying on external audits, or maybe you don't have a formal detection system in place. The reason this would be quite interesting because for me personally, it'd be quite useful to understand kind of where that, if you like, sits with the audience currently. I don't know if it hasn't come live on my screen, but I'm going to operate on the assumption that it is live currently. Now, I'm going to move on if that's okay, just because that poll hasn't come up on my screen. But one of the things that we've kind of alluded to, and forgive me, this is where we do the kind of the praising ourselves or the book plug if I was on a radio show. But so what we've actually recently rolled out a case study with a customer we've worked with ourselves who were there's a company called Partner Hero, fast growing BPO, 3,000 plus employees across 7 entities, 6 regions, and they were having a lot of challenges in maintaining consistent financial controls and approval transparency. So now, not only do we help them solve that, but that came with some added benefits. So 60% reduction in approval times, which meant they could do things quicker. We also save teams around 200 hours on a monthly basis, which it's about cost saving about $5,500 for them. And that isn't on a small scale. This is across 90 people in multiple entities. Robert, with that in mind, have you encountered a case where automated approvals either helped uncover a hidden fraud or where that kind of process of using automated approvals could have solved the challenge had it been in place?
I think that's the important thing is how many people measure and how do they measure and understand that you've prevented a fraud. Let's
Yeah,
be honest, the legislation around fraud is an intent to deprive somebody or to make a gain from another. So therefore, you should be monitoring it. And strictly speaking, even if they don't get away with it, it's a fraud and it should be dealt with. But when I see that on here now, we've got 36% of people don't have a formal detection system in place, Ian, that would elude me to think, well, hold on, how do they know whether they've got this fraud going on or not? So
yeah,
I think what we see all the time and regularly, and thankfully they've got a system, so therefore it prevents that fraud. And that's exactly what it's there for, as you would always allude to, I'm sure, is there to protect your business and prevent fraudulent activity. When it's too late and it has gone through, and you think to yourself, this is ridiculous. If they only had that in place, it would have stopped a fraud, is
yeah.
very, very common. Very, very common. And I deal with it regularly whereby you've got to be careful because you sound very clever after the event, don't you? If you'd have had a bit of a system
Hindsight's
in
2020, isn't it?
yeah, exactly that, Ian. And actually, you don't want to be doing that. You want to work with them and see if you can monitor it and match it. But what people don't understand is how simplistic that is, Ian.
Yeah,
Because ultimately, if you'd had a continuous monitoring system in place and you're regularly reviewing and monitoring your transactional data and you're up to speed and managing your supply chain registration and you're managing everything that goes around that from your procure to pay systems, and that's my background. I worked for 10 years at Transport for London as head of fraud, and I saw this day in, day out, where sadly procurement is seen as a pain in the backside, dare I say, because you slow the process down.
yeah,
But they're there for a reason. And
yeah,
back to Ian's question, that's what stops it. Procurement is there for that reason, to protect the business and you as an individual. They're protecting you, and that's the process and why they want to do it. And I think that's the important thing. So I see regularly whereby, unfortunately, sadly, an organization doesn't have it in place necessarily, or they have some. We look to circumvent those controls. Back to your point, Ian, we look to circumvent them for speed, for cost in some people's eyes. Oh, it's quicker, it's cheaper. We'll just go through and do it. When actually, that controlled system would not have happened. That automated system would have stopped you. There's
yeah,
no way you would have fallen foul to that fraud. But you haven't got an automated system. You're relying on it manually. There is no real-time checks. And before you know it, there you are. And as you can see from the tips to prevent it there, is ultimately, it's really quite basic, isn't it?
yeah.
Let's be honest. I don't mean that to sound patronizing, but if you haven't got anything in place, how much more vulnerable and how much wider is that door open than somebody's got automated systems in place?
Yeah.
There's too many transactions in to do it manually.
Yeah, and you touched on it there. There's one of the numbers that really jumped out at me, which is the no formal detection system. Not for the reason you might think. I was reading an
Mhm.
article on Business Wire. It's like 93% of UK companies have faced vendor fraud in 2024. Okay, so that's a big number. The one that jumped out more is 36% of people in the audience, obviously in the audience, haven't got a formal detection system.
Mm,
That same article cited 42% suffered multiple incidents. Now that 42 is very close to 36.
yeah.
Um, so there's a clear kind of I would say maybe it's obviously an assumption on my part right now, but I would assume those that have kind of no formal detection system are probably within that 42% who suffer multiple incidents of vendor fraud, because if you have no system, you don't catch the first one. So I know
Isn't that interesting though? Is that 36%, and you're saying there's also other stats out there as well, Ian, that replicate exactly that feeling. What is that barrier to having a formal detection system in place? And I feel for you guys, you're working in the business. I'm sure you want it. A, it protects you. B, it would protect the business. Is it a lack of understanding? Is it, i.e., from an IT perspective or whatever it may be? Is it a lack of resources and funding to pay for it? And let's be honest about it, they pay for themselves, because otherwise, the minute you're a victim of fraud, then I'm afraid that will cost you far more than it would to have a system. What is it that reticent to accept that you potentially have got a problem and you don't want to monitor it? Or is it just something completely different? And I'm just interested in the minutiae of that, if you like, as to exactly why is it you wouldn't have final. It's almost like you and your in your home life, guys, with regards to a mobile phone or something, and you don't have any two-factor authentication. What's the difference? I don't get it.
Yeah, and I can only speak from my experience of the people that I work with. 9 times out of 10, the barrier seems to be budgets. Because it's often these systems require additional budget or additional cost. The businesses often are hesitant. Whereas, like you say, if you put it into the context of kind of day-to-day life, you probably wouldn't go on holiday without holiday insurance, as an example. Yes, it's an additional cost, but it pays for itself, because theoretically you never have to spend any more should the worst happen.
As someone said there, Ian, on the last comment, June Burke, thank you for that. Most business thinks it'll never happen to them. And that's the same as you and I standing at a bus stop with our mobile phone in our hand, and somebody drives by and takes it out your hand off of a motorbike. Same thing. We never believe it will happen to us. All I can say here, back to Ian's point, is through experience, it's far cheaper, far more efficient, far more effective to have something in place beforehand than it is afterwards.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm mindful we've only got a couple of minutes left before the end of the session, and there's something that I wanted to put to you. I know we've got another poll as well, so I'm going to ask if we can launch the third poll now, and then whilst that's live, Robert, I'm going to just put this question to you because I was really interested to kind of get your thoughts on, if you were advising a CFO today, what would be the top 3 fraud prevention priorities that you would recommend they focus on going into the rest of 2025?
Fantastic. What a great question. Yeah, it's easy, isn't it, really, for me, potentially, but also for yourselves and for all of us. We've talked about it all a lot today, and it's kind of just having a summary of exactly what we've got here. My first would be understanding your fraud risks, highlighting exactly where they are, knowing how to mitigate them and how to protect your business. Secondly, would be education, awareness and training for both your supply chain, your customers and your staff, because how can you ever expect anyone to report fraud if they don't actually know what it is? And it could be going on for years without you knowing. And like we've alluded to earlier on, and Ian's alluded to, these things happen. And they do happen. And sadly, it's what you pay for it afterwards. And the third, and most importantly, and I think you could say it's a Radio 2 link, but ultimately the reason for that is you've got to have continuous monitoring. We need to have something in place to protect our business. We can't expect that 36%, 42% that we just alluded to be able to protect it ourselves manually. That doesn't mean to say AI will do away with your jobs if that's one of the other reasons you're concerned. It only enhances your job and helps you, and the human interaction with that actually defines exactly how you work and how you prevent, because you've then got to build in the control processes in place. So you've got the risk assessments. You now have to go back to that, say, right, we've had an issue, but what we've done now is mitigated it and we're managing it by importing this. And it's a continual circle. And I think that's the 3: education, awareness and training, ensuring that you've got robust policies, procedures alongside, obviously alongside a system to help you in your fight against fraud.
Fantastic. And just now that the poll results are coming, one of the reasons I was quite interested in this, 8% of the respondents said they haven't faced fraud, which is very close to the 8% of UK companies who said they haven't faced vendor fraud in 2024. So
Wow.
there's definitely a correlation there in the results in terms of the data that Business Y reported on seems to be validated by those in the panel.
And I know my only question to that, Ian, is why is that? Education awareness, and how do you expect to, and I've had this, no fraud here, sir. And then
Yeah.
FD said to me, no fraud here. I asked the question, how much education awareness and training do you do? What do I want to educate people on how to commit fraud for?
Yeah.
Well, how do you expect them to report it if they don't even know what it is? And
Yeah.
I would query that 8% along those lines.
Yeah. Yeah, it'd be interesting. One to throw open to the group maybe next time we can, if we've got an open discussion opportunity. So I'm mindful we're running out of time. I think we're overrunning already. So
We have.
I'll round up the key takeaways. I think look, we've highlighted how modern fraud is evolving, and there's a hidden risk here through manual processes, lack of education, and often a lack of automation. So those three elements, I think, are big critical things that businesses can do to close those gaps as fraud evolves. Now, from a next steps perspective, if you'd like to have a chat with myself or Robert, I'm sure you can reach out to us. I know we haven't got around to the Q&As today, but obviously if there's a way for us to facilitate those after the fact, then I'm more than happy to answer any questions that there are.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you.